April 23, 1945, 7:12 in the morning. The war in Europe was dying, but it was taking its time. In a converted barn outside the German town of Verim, Bavaria, 6 boys knelt in a line against the eastern wall. Their hands were tied behind their backs with American rope. Their breath came out white in the cold morning air, small clouds that disappeared as quickly as they formed. The oldest might have been 15 years old. The youngest looked barely 10. They wore Wehrmacht uniforms that hung off their thin frames like costumes from a theatrical production gone catastrophically wrong. Boots, several sizes too large, had been stuffed with newspaper that had worn through, leaving blisters that had bled and crusted over. Their faces were smudged with grime and exhaustion and fear, the kind of fear that comes from knowing exactly what happens next. The barn smelled of old hay and motor oil and unwashed bodies. Morning light filtered through gaps in the wooden walls, creating diagonal beams that cut through the dust. A sparrow had built a nest in the rafters. Its morning song seemed obscene in the silence. 6 pairs of eyes watched the doorway, waiting. Heinrich Furber kept his chin raised, 15 years old, from Berlin. What remained of Berlin? He maintained a rigid military bearing despite the terror that made his hands shake behind his back. A thin scar ran along his jawline from shrapnel. He positioned himself slightly forward of the others, a protective gesture, as if his 15-year-old body could somehow shield the children beside him from what was coming. Next to him, Lucas Hoffmann had his knees drawn up to his chest, 10 years old, from Stuttgart. The uniform they'd given him was comically oversized. Tears tracked clean lines down his dirty cheeks, but he made no sound. He had learned that crying brought punishment. Wolfgang Bauer sat rigid, 12 years old, from Dresden. His face held profound confusion rather than fear. For 3 days no one had struck him. They had been given water, thin soup, a blanket. The cognitive dissonance was almost physical in its intensity. Everything he'd been taught said Americans were brutal, yet here they were, still alive. Klaus Richter, 14, from Munich, sat with his eyes closed, the son of a mechanic. He had his father's pragmatic approach to impossible situations. But there was no mechanism here that made sense, no logical reason they should still be alive. Dieter Schneider, 13, from Hamburg, kept very still. Farm training. When threatened, animals either bolt or freeze. Dieter had chosen freeze. He came from 4 generations of farmers. His father had lost his left arm at Verdun in 1918 and had spent the next 27 years teaching his son that the earth never lied to you. Franz Keller, 11 years old, from Cologne, had nowhere else to go. His parents had died when Allied bombers reduced Cologne to rubble in 1942. When the Volkssturm recruiters came through the displaced children's shelter, they promised food, shelter, and purpose. For an orphan child with no other options, even military service in a losing war seemed better than starving. Franz sat slightly apart from the others. He trusted no one, not these boys beside him, not the Americans who held them, not God, if he existed. The only person Franz Keller trusted was Franz Keller, and that trust was provisional at best. The sound of boots on gravel outside froze all 6 boys into absolute stillness. This was it. 3 days earlier, they had been captured during the American advance through southern Bavaria. They'd been found manning an anti-aircraft position, though none of them knew how to properly operate the weapon. When the Americans arrived, 2 boys had surrendered immediately, Klaus and Franz. The others had tried to run, but they were too exhausted, too malnourished, too young. No shots had been fired during their capture. The American soldiers had simply walked up to where they lay in the field. One soldier, a sergeant, had looked down at Lucas and said something in English that none of them understood. But his tone had been clear enough. He sounded sad. They had been transported to this barn, given water, given thin soup, given blankets, and then nothing. 3 days of waiting, 3 days of wondering when the execution would come. The door opened. Heinrich closed his eyes. Beside him, Lucas began to pray in a whisper. Wolfgang sat straighter, trying to meet death with dignity. Klaus calculated angles with the part of his mind that never stopped analyzing. Dieter thought about spring planting. Franz thought about nothing, his mind carefully blank. Captain Nathaniel Sullivan stood in the doorway and looked at 6 faces that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He was 38 years old, from Fort Worth, Texas, a father of 3 children back home. Robert, 12 years old, Margaret, 9, Grace, 6. His wife Eleanor was a nurse who had volunteered at the Veterans Hospital since the war began. Sullivan had enlisted in 1942, had fought across the Pacific, Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Okinawa. He had seen enough death to last several lifetimes. But those had been soldiers, men who understood, at least theoretically, what they had signed up for. These were children. The disconnect between what these boys should have been, worrying about schoolwork, playing games, learning trades, and what they had become, threatened to overwhelm his professional composure. He had orders sitting on his makeshift desk in the adjacent room. The protocol for captured enemy combatants was clear, regardless of age. But something in Sullivan rebelled against the very idea of treating these exhausted children as hardened soldiers deserving of harsh interrogation, or worse. Behind him, Sergeant Margot Hoffman stood with her translator's notebook clutched against her chest. 31 years old, German-American, had grown up speaking both languages in Pennsylvania after her family emigrated in 1923. Her jaw was clenched. Tears pooled in her eyes that she refused to let fall. She had interviewed all 6 boys over the past 3 days. The interview with Heinrich had broken something inside her. He had recounted his mother and sister's deaths in the February bombing of Berlin, how he had tried to keep the younger boys alive during the retreat, sharing his meager rations with Lucas when the 10-year-old was too weak to march. At the end of the interview, Heinrich had looked at her directly and asked, "Will they execute us? Please just tell me the truth." The younger ones, Lucas and Franz, they're so scared. If we're going to die, I need to prepare them. That was when Sergeant Margot Hoffman, professional army translator and naturalized American citizen, had begun to cry. Sullivan looked at her now. She met his eyes. A lifetime of understanding passed between them in that glance. In the barn, Heinrich opened his eyes. He had expected American soldiers with rifles. Instead, he saw a captain in a clean uniform and a woman holding a notebook. The captain's face was weathered but not cruel. The woman had been crying. This was somehow worse than rifles. Uncertainty was its own kind of torture. Sullivan stepped into the barn. Behind him, a third figure appeared, Private Silas Porter, 24 years old, from Savannah, Georgia, an African-American soldier who had grown up in the Jim Crow South. He had 3 nephews back in Georgia: Marcus, 12 years old, Samuel, 10, Isaiah, 8. He had helped raise them while their father worked 16-hour shifts in the cotton mill. When he looked at the 6 German boys huddled in the barn, he saw Marcus in Heinrich's protective posture, saw Samuel in Lucas's frightened eyes, saw Isaiah in Franz's defensive suspicion. Sullivan walked slowly toward the center of the barn. The 6 boys watched him with the wary attention of animals that had learned humans bring pain. He stopped about 10 feet away. "Sergeant Hoffman," he said, "tell them I have read their files. Tell them I know their stories." Margot translated in German. Her voice was steady now, though her hands still trembled. Sullivan continued, "Tell them I have a son, 12 years old, named Robert. He likes baseball and hates mathematics and wants to be a pilot when he grows up." Margot translated. Confusion rippled across the boys' faces. "Tell them," Sullivan said quietly, "that when I look at them, I see Robert. I see every child who should be in school, not in a war." The translation hung in the air of the barn. Heinrich's expression shifted from resignation to bewilderment. Beside him, Lucas's crying had stopped, replaced by an expression of fragile hope. Sullivan turned to Porter. "Private Porter, I need you to be their primary guard. Not their warden. Their guard. Do you understand the distinction I'm making?" Porter nodded slowly. "I believe I do, sir. They're to be treated as children under military protection, not as prisoners of war. They eat when we eat. They sleep when we sleep. If they're scared, Private Porter, I need you to remember your nephews. and I need you to help them remember they're children, not soldiers." "Yes, sir," Porter said. His voice was thick with emotion he didn't try to hide. Sullivan turned back to the boys. Through Margot, he said, "You are no longer in immediate danger. You will not be executed. You will not be tortured. You will be held here until we determine what happens next. But you will be treated with dignity. Do you understand?" Margot translated. 6 boys stared in disbelief. Wolfgang spoke first, his voice cracking. "Warum?" "Why?" Sullivan looked at him for a long moment before answering. "Because you're somebody's children," he said, "and somebody loved you before this war tried to turn you into something you were never meant to be." The translation seemed to physically impact the boys. Heinrich's military bearing finally cracked. His shoulders sagged. Lucas began to sob, not from fear this time, but from the overwhelming relief of being seen as human rather than enemy. Even Franz, suspicious Franz who trusted no one, felt something break inside his carefully constructed walls. Sullivan left the barn without another word. Margot followed, wiping her eyes. Porter remained. He looked at the 6 boys. 6 pairs of eyes looked back. "My name is Silas," he said in English, knowing they wouldn't understand the words but hoping they might understand the tone. "I'm going to take care of you." In Sullivan's temporary office, he sat alone at his desk. The orders from division headquarters lay before him. The directive was clear. All captured enemy combatants, regardless of age, were to be processed according to standard military protocol. There was an addendum, marked confidential, noting that several child soldiers captured in recent weeks had been affiliated with the werewolf resistance movement. The memo recommended extreme caution. Some commanders had interpreted extreme caution as grounds for summary execution. Sullivan picked up the orders, read them one more time, then placed them in his desk drawer and turned the key in the lock. On his desk sat a photograph. Eleanor and the 3 children, taken in Fort Worth 2 years ago. Robert grinning gap-toothed at the camera, Margaret making a silly face, Grace holding her mother's hand. Sullivan touched the photograph gently. "Forgive me if I'm wrong," he said quietly to the empty room, "but I can't. I just can't." That night, Lucas Hoffman woke screaming. The nightmare was always the same. His mother's voice calling his name, the sound of aircraft engines growing louder, the whistle of falling bombs, the moment of impact that turned day into fire. Waking up in the rubble, choking on dust, calling for his mother who would never answer. He screamed in German, wordless at first, then calling, "Mutti! Mutti!" over and over, the desperate cry of a child who has lost everything. Heinrich woke instantly, moving to comfort the younger boy. "Alles wird gut, kleiner Bruder," he whispered. "Everything will be okay, little brother." A promise he had no power to keep, but made anyway, because that's what survived of honor in the wreckage. The other boys woke too. Wolfgang shifted uncomfortably. Klaus sat up but said nothing. Dieter watched with patient quiet. Franz remained still, his own nightmares too close to the surface. In the small room adjacent to the barn, Private Silas Porter heard the screaming. He lay there for a moment, listening to Heinrich's soft reassurances, to Lucas's diminishing sobs. He could ignore it. Should ignore it, perhaps. They were prisoners, enemy soldiers, technically, despite their age. But he thought about Samuel, 10 years old, who still sometimes woke from nightmares about the time he nearly drowned in the creek. How Samuel would call for his mother, and how Porter would sit with him in the darkness until the fear passed. Porter rose from his cot, pulled on his boots, walked quietly to the barn. The 6 boys tensed when the door opened. Heinrich moved protectively in front of Lucas, but Porter didn't speak, didn't reprimand, didn't order silence. He simply walked to the corner of the barn and sat down on the floor, his back against the wall. He looked at the 6 boys. They looked back. "It's all right," he said softly in English they couldn't understand. "Bad dreams don't mean you're weak, they mean you're human." He stayed there, didn't sleep, just sat in the darkness with 6 frightened children until the grey light of dawn began filtering through the gaps in the barn walls. Heinrich watched this American soldier, this man who had no obligation to care, who by all rights should treat them as enemies. watched him sacrifice his own sleep to sit guard not over them, but with them. The propaganda had taught Heinrich that Americans were brutal, uncivilized, incapable of mercy or honor. The propaganda, Heinrich was beginning to realize, had lied about many things. As the sun rose on their fourth day of captivity, the 6 boys began to understand that something fundamental had changed. They didn't know what would happen next, didn't know if they would live or die. But for the first time since their capture, they began to believe they might be seen as something other than enemy combatants. They began to believe they might be seen as children. It was a fragile belief, easily shattered. But in the cold April morning, in a converted barn outside a town whose name they could barely pronounce, it was enough. It was a beginning. Private Silas Porter woke at 5 in the morning on the 5th day. Habit and intention combined. He dressed quietly in the pre-dawn darkness and made his way to the company mess. The cook, a weathered sergeant from Kansas, looked up from his coffee with surprise. "Porter, what brings you here at this ungodly hour?" "I need to use the kitchen, Sergeant, and I need supplies." The cook studied him for a moment. "This about those German boys?" "Yes, Sergeant." A long pause. Then the cook nodded toward the pantry. "Take what you need." "But Porter, you cooking breakfast for prisoners? You're cooking breakfast for the whole damn camp. I won't have men saying we treat the enemy better than our own." "Understood, Sergeant. I'll make enough for everyone." Porter gathered what he needed: cornmeal, flour, butter, a luxury they'd recently received in supply, eggs, milk powder to be reconstituted. For the chili, he found beef that had been earmarked for the officers' mess, along with kidney beans, tomatoes, onions, and the precious spices he'd carried with him from Georgia in a small tin his grandmother had given him. Cumin, chili powder, dried peppers. He began to cook the way his grandmother had taught him, with intention, with care, with the understanding that food was more than sustenance. It was memory, it was home, it was love made tangible. The cornbread came first. He mixed the cornmeal with flour, added eggs and milk, a generous amount of butter. His grandmother's recipe called for a touch of honey. He poured the batter into cast iron skillets and slid them into the oven. Then the chili. He browned the beef slowly, letting the fat render out, letting the meat develop that deep, caramelized crust. Added onions that sizzled and turned translucent. Garlic that filled the kitchen with its pungent promise. Then the tomatoes, the beans, the spices. He adjusted the heat, let it simmer, tasted and adjusted again. The smell began to drift across the compound at approximately 6:15 in the morning. In the barn, Heinrich woke first. His eyes opened in the grey pre-dawn light, and he lay still for a moment, trying to identify what had changed. Then he smelled it. His stomach clenched with hunger so intense it was almost painful. He sat up slowly. The smell was impossible. Rich, fatty, real food, not the thin soup or hard bread they'd been given. The other boys were beginning to stir, their faces confused. "Was ist das?" Wolfgang whispered. "What is that?" "Ich weiß nicht," Heinrich replied. "I don't know." But his body knew. His body, starved for months on Wehrmacht rations that had grown progressively worse as the Reich collapsed, recognized the smell of real cooking. Butter, meat, spices that had no place in a war zone. Klaus sat up, his analytical mind trying to categorize the scent. "Fleisch," he said with certainty. "Meat, real meat." Lucas was crying again, but not from fear this time, from hunger, from the almost painful hope that the smell represented. Even Franz, suspicious Franz, could not maintain his distrust in the face of that smell. His mouth watered involuntarily. His stomach growled loud enough for the others to hear. At 6:45, Porter pulled the cornbread from the oven. The top was golden brown, almost bronze. The butter had melted into the surface, creating small pools of yellow richness. Steam rose from the skillets in visible ribbons. He cut the cornbread into generous squares, the knife releasing even more of that buttery aroma. He ladled the chili into deep bowls. The liquid was thick, dark red, studded with chunks of beef and beans. He added a dollop of sour cream that the officers' mess had received in their last supply drop. He arranged everything on a metal tray, the bowls of chili still steaming, the cornbread wrapped in a clean cloth to stay warm, spoons, napkins. Then, he carried it across the compound toward the barn. The smell preceded him like an announcement, like a promise, like something that made no sense in the context of war and captivity. Inside the barn, 6 boys scrambled to their feet. Heinrich positioned himself slightly in front of the others. Wolfgang stood rigidly at attention. Klaus watched with wary calculation. Dieter went very still. Lucas pressed close to Heinrich. Franz positioned himself slightly apart, ready to run or fight or endure. The door opened. Porter entered carrying the tray. The steam from the chili created visible ribbons in the cold morning air. The smell intensified, filling the barn, overwhelming every other sensory input. The 6 boys stood frozen, unable to reconcile what they were seeing with what they had been taught to expect. Porter set the tray down on an overturned crate, stepped back, made his hands visible and empty. He smiled, that same warm, genuine smile his nephews knew so well. "It's okay," he said softly in English they still didn't understand. "It's just food. You must be hungry." He gestured toward the tray, mimed eating, pointed to them, then to the food. No one moved. They had been taught that Americans were brutal, that capture meant torture and death, that any kindness was prelude to cruelty. The smell of the food was overwhelming. Lucas swayed slightly, dizzy from hunger. Heinrich's hands trembled. Franz broke first. The 11-year-old orphan who trusted no one found that hunger overrode caution. He had not eaten real food in so long. The thin soup they'd been given was barely adequate. This smell promised something his body desperately needed. He moved slowly toward the tray, his eyes never leaving Porter's face. Porter nodded encouragingly and stepped back further. Franz reached out with a trembling hand, picked up a piece of cornbread. The texture surprised him, still warm, soft, completely unlike the sawdust bread the Wehrmacht had been producing. He lifted it to his nose, smelled butter and corn and something sweet. He took a small bite. His eyes widened. The taste was extraordinary. Not because it was sophisticated, but because it was real. Butter, honey, actual ingredients that tasted like what they were supposed to be. He took another bite, larger this time. Then all 6 boys moved at once. Heinrich abandoned his protective stance. Wolfgang forgot his military bearing. Klaus stopped analyzing. Dieter stopped being still. Lucas stumbled forward. They descended on the food with desperate hunger. The cornbread disappeared first. They ate with their hands, stuffing pieces into their mouths. The butter and honey coated their fingers. Some of them made small sounds of pleasure or relief. Then they discovered the chili. Heinrich picked up a bowl and a spoon, his hands shaking so badly he nearly dropped both. He lifted a spoonful to his mouth. The first taste of real beef in months, seasoned, cooked with care. The warmth spread through his chest like something medicinal. That's when he started crying. Not from sadness, not from fear, from the overwhelming relief of being warm and fed and treated like a human being rather than an enemy to be destroyed. Tears fell into his bowl, mixing with the chili, but he couldn't stop eating, couldn't stop crying. Lucas was crying too, but he was only 10, and he had less practice hiding emotion. He ate and sobbed simultaneously. The food was so good. He was so hungry. The Americans were being kind. Nothing made sense, but the cornbread tasted like something his mother might have made, and that thought was too much to bear. Wolfgang stared at his bowl through tears he didn't understand. The propaganda had been so certain. Americans were mongrels, barbarians, incapable of civilization or mercy. Yet here was this black soldier, smiling warmly, bringing them food that was better than anything Wolfgang had eaten in the Hitler Youth. His entire worldview was crumbling with each bite. Klaus ate methodically despite his tears, his mechanic's mind trying to understand what was happening. Why feed condemned prisoners? Unless they weren't condemned, unless something had changed. Dieter thought of his grandmother's Sunday cooking. This chili tasted like that same care, like someone had cooked it with intention rather than obligation. Franz had stopped being suspicious. The food was too good, the soldier's smile too genuine. He ate ravenously and felt something crack inside his carefully constructed walls. Porter watched them eat, watched them cry, felt his own chest tighten with emotion he didn't try to suppress. He thought about Marcus and Samuel and Isaiah back in Georgia, thought about his grandmother's insistence that feeding people was an act of love, and that love could cross any boundary if you let it. He moved closer, pulled out his handkerchief, clean, recently washed, offered it to Lucas, who was crying hardest. Lucas took it with trembling fingers, whispered something in German that Porter couldn't understand, but whose meaning was unmistakable. Danke, danke schön. Thank you very much. Porter nodded. You're welcome, son. You're very welcome. The disconnect between propaganda and reality created a cognitive dissonance that was almost physically painful. For years, these boys had been fed a steady diet of lies. America was brutal. Americans were criminals. They would show no mercy. Yet here they were, crying into bowls of chili that someone had cooked with care. The propaganda had lied. That single realization, repeated across 6 young minds simultaneously, was devastating in its implications. If the propaganda had lied about this, what else was false? If Americans could be kind, could show mercy, then what did that mean about everything they had been taught? What did it mean about Germany, about the war, about the cause they had been told was righteous and necessary? The questions had no answers. Not yet. But they planted themselves in fertile ground. In the weeks that followed, the barn transformed. Captain Sullivan brought books, English primers with pictures and simple words, a battered blackboard salvaged from a bombed schoolhouse, chalk, paper, pencils, and his personal baseball from Fort Worth, Texas, worn smooth from years of use. Sergeant Margot Hoffman conducted formal lessons each morning, grammar, pronunciation, vocabulary. She had started with professional detachment, but watching these boys struggle with irregular verbs awakened something maternal in her nature. She found herself staying beyond required hours, bringing picture books, creating simple games that made education feel less like work. Dieter proved to have exceptional aptitude for languages. Klaus approached English the way he approached mechanics, taking it apart systematically. Franz participated because refusing would mean isolation. Heinrich learned quickly, driven by responsibility. Lucas struggled but persevered. Wolfgang sat apart during the first several sessions, arms crossed, face set in stubborn refusal. Learning English felt like betraying his German identity, but he listened, despite himself. His natural competitiveness eventually overcame his ideological resistance. In the afternoons, Porter taught baseball. He started with the basics: how to hold the ball, how to throw, how to catch. Catch, he would call, tossing the ball gently to Heinrich. Throw, he would instruct, gesturing for the boy to return it. The game provided structure and normalcy. Klaus discovered he could predict trajectory. Dieter had farm-strong hands that caught reliably. Heinrich's competitive nature emerged. Even Franz began to smile when he made a particularly good catch. Evening became cooking time. Porter taught them to make cornbread. Klaus discovered he had an aptitude for cooking that surprised everyone. His mechanical mind translated well to following recipes. He began experimenting, combining American ingredients with German techniques, creating hybrid dishes that represented his own confused identity. Neither fully German nor fully American, but something new. Margot brought traditional German recipes to share. Spätzle, Sauerbraten, foods that tasted like home and memory. You can be German without being Nazi, she told them. Your culture is something to be proud of. The ideology was the disease, not the people, not the food, not the language, not you. This distinction was crucial. They needed to understand that their identity wasn't the problem. The system that had weaponized their identity was the problem. Meals became the most important part of each day. Porter taught them to say grace before meals, not as religious indoctrination, but as a moment of gratitude and reflection. Heinrich struggled with the concept initially. What did they have to be grateful for? But gradually he came to understand that gratitude was not about denying pain. It was about recognizing moments of goodness, even in terrible circumstances. Young Lucas began to smile during meals. His nightmares became less frequent, as if the daily ritual of shared meals provided enough security to ease his sleeping mind. Then came the night Wolfgang disappeared. It was the 12th night of their captivity. Porter did his usual evening check at 10 o'clock. 6 boys sleeping. He locked the barn door and retired to his adjacent room. At approximately 2 in the morning, Wolfgang woke. He had been thinking about this for days, planning, waiting. He was 12 years old. He believed, or wanted to believe, that Germany could still win, that the werewolf resistance movement was real, that if he could reach them, he could report on American positions, could fulfill his duty, could prove he wasn't a coward who had surrendered. He had loosened the bars on the small window over several nights. Now he worked them free completely, squeezed through, dropped to the ground outside, stood for a moment in the darkness, breathing free air. Then he ran toward Dresden. Morning came. Porter entered the barn with breakfast. He counted heads automatically. 5 boys. The window bars were bent outward. Porter's stomach dropped. "Where's Wolfgang?" Heinrich sat up, looked around. Ist weg. He's gone." Porter ran to find Sullivan. Within minutes, the compound was on alert. Search parties organized. Sullivan sent word to local American units to watch for a 12-year-old German boy traveling alone. Margot Hoffman wept openly when she heard. "He'll die out there," she said. "Germany is hell right now. He's 12 years old." Sullivan put a hand on her shoulder, said nothing. They both knew she was probably right. 18 hours passed. The search parties found nothing. Sullivan began to draft the report that would document Wolfgang's escape and presumed death. Then, at 8:30 in the evening, a sentry reported a small figure approaching from the east. Staggering, barely able to walk. Wolfgang. Porter ran out to meet him. The 12-year-old's clothes were torn. His face was scratched and bleeding. His feet had left bloody prints. He was crying. Porter didn't yell, didn't grab him roughly, simply embraced the child and felt him collapse into the hug. "You came back," Porter said. "You came back." In the barn, Margot translated Wolfgang's story. He had run 15 kilometers toward Dresden, driven by duty and ideology. Found the city, his home, was nothing but rubble. Mountains of broken stone where neighborhoods had been. Bodies still being pulled from collapsed buildings. He had searched for his street. It didn't exist anymore, just debris and death. He had encountered a group claiming to be werewolf resistance. They weren't noble warriors. They were desperate, brutal men who had nothing left to lose. When they saw Wolfgang, they didn't welcome him. They aimed guns at him and called him a deserter. Wolfgang had realized in that moment that the Germany he believed in didn't exist, maybe never had existed. The glorious fatherland of his imagination was a lie, built on propaganda and wishful thinking. So he turned around and walked back to the barn, back to the Americans who had fed him cornbread, back to the only place that currently offered safety. "Ich habe kein Zuhause," he said, voice breaking. "I have no home to return to." Heinrich embraced him, then Klaus, then Dieter, then Franz, then little Lucas. 6 boys holding each other in the dim light of the barn. Porter watched from the doorway, wiping his eyes. That night, Heinrich asked Margot a question that had been building for weeks. What we believed about America was wrong. What else did they lie to us about? Margot looked at Sullivan. Sullivan nodded. The next day, they gathered all 6 boys in the barn for the conversation that would destroy and rebuild them in equal measure. Sullivan had brought newspapers, photographs, documentation from the liberation of Bergen-Belsen, Dachau, Buchenwald. Images carefully selected to convey truth without unnecessary trauma, though any truth about the camps was inherently traumatic. Through Margot, Sullivan explained that American and British forces had discovered camps across Germany and Poland where millions of people had been systematically imprisoned, starved, worked to death, murdered in industrial fashion. He showed them photographs. Human beings reduced to skeletons, piles of bodies, children their age and younger, starved to the point where their skulls showed through their skin. Ovens, gas chambers, mass graves. The 6 boys looked at evidence their minds desperately wanted to reject. Wolfgang spoke first, voice rising. Das ist Propaganda. Amerikanische Lügen. That's propaganda. American lies. But his voice lacked conviction. The photographs showed American soldiers standing among the victims. The expressions on the soldiers' faces, horror, grief, rage, were too genuine to be staged. Heinrich stared at the images and felt his entire understanding of reality crumbling. He had heard whispers, rumors in the Volkssturm about special camps, but he had dismissed them as exaggerations. Now he looked at photographic evidence, at children like himself systematically murdered, at the industrial scale of the killing. And he understood with horrible clarity what his mother and sister had died defending. Ich habe dafür gekämpft, he whispered. I fought for this? Klaus was crying silently. His father had always maintained careful distance from Nazi ideology. Klaus understood now why. His father had known, or suspected, had protected his son through deliberate silence. Lucas didn't fully understand the implications, but he understood that something terrible had happened. He moved closer to Heinrich. Dieter sat very still. Every lesson about honor and duty revealed as grotesque lies. Franz looked at the photographs with an expression almost vindicated. He had trusted nothing and no one. Now he had proof. Wolfgang trembled as every belief he held shattered. Fatherland, glory, defending civilization, all of it built on foundations of industrialized murder. He was 12 years old, and his entire worldview was destroyed in the space of 20 minutes. He ran to the corner of the barn and vomited, then sat there staring at nothing. Heinrich gripped his head in his hands and sobbed. Was haben wir geworden? What have we become? Margot was crying as she translated their reactions back to Sullivan. Sullivan looked at the 6 boys with profound sadness. They needed to know, he said quietly. They can't move forward believing lies. That night, all 6 boys had worse nightmares than ever before. Not nightmares about bombs or battles. Nightmares about complicity, about guilt. Porter slept in the barn that night, holding each boy when he woke screaming, offering no platitudes, just presence in the darkness. 1 week later, Major General Everett Hartwell arrived unannounced for inspection. He was 52 years old, a career officer who had fought in the First World War. He had received reports that Captain Sullivan was violating protocol by treating enemy child soldiers as refugees rather than prisoners of war. He came to investigate. Sullivan met him at attention. Captain, Hartwell said, I understand you have 6 German prisoners who should have been processed for transfer weeks ago. Yes, General. Show me. They walked to the barn. Inside, the 6 boys stood immediately at attention when the General entered. They were clean, healthy, well-fed. They wore civilian clothes. The barn had been transformed into something between a classroom and a dormitory. Hartwell observed the English primers stacked neatly, the baseball in the corner, the makeshift chalkboard. Through Margot, he questioned Heinrich directly. How have you been treated? Sehr gut, Herr General. Very well, Sir General. Coerced? Mistreated? Nein, nur Güte. No, only kindness. What do you want, boy? Heinrich paused, then answered carefully in halting English. Sir, I do not know what I want, but I know I cannot go back to Germany believing what I believed before. Captain Sullivan showed us truth, difficult truth. Now I must decide what to do with this knowledge. Hartwell studied the 15-year-old for a long moment, then spoke with Porter, who explained his role with simple honesty. Finally, Hartwell requested a private meeting with Sullivan. In the farmhouse office, he sat heavily and was silent for a long time. Captain, you've created a situation that has no precedent in military regulations. Yes, sir. You violated protocol, ignored orders. Yes, sir. Another long pause. Exactly like I did, Hartwell said quietly. December 1918. Found 3 German boys, ages 11, 13, 15. Their unit had abandoned them. They were starving. Protocol said process them for POW camps. I gave them my rations instead. He looked at Sullivan directly. I never knew if I did the right thing, but I couldn't let children starve when I had food. You understand? Yes, sir, I understand. Your boys can't stay here indefinitely. Find them permanent solution before war officially ends. I'll cover you as long as I can. But Sullivan, this is on you. You're responsible for what happens to them now. I understand, sir. Hartwell stood to leave, paused at the door. My son died at Normandy, 20 years old. If some German had shown him mercy when he was their age, his voice caught. Well, do right by those boys, Captain. Yes, sir. I will, sir. Within days, Klaus Richter developed severe abdominal pain. Within hours, he was feverish and writhing. The doctor diagnosed appendicitis and said surgery was immediately necessary. But surgery meant hospital. Hospital meant records. Records meant exposure. Sullivan faced an impossible choice. Let a 14-year-old die to maintain security or risk everything to save one boy. He chose the boy. Klaus was rushed to the hospital under false documentation. The surgery was successful, but a sharp-eyed nurse recognized that his civilian clothes had recently replaced a Wehrmacht uniform. She reported it. Within 48 hours, Sullivan was facing an investigation. A major demanded to know why an enemy child soldier had received treatment reserved for civilians. Sullivan explained the entire situation. Margot testified. Porter volunteered to take full responsibility. The investigation threatened to destroy everything. Then, General Hartwell intervened. He classified the situation as special humanitarian case and killed the investigation with his authority. But he called Sullivan to his office. This is your final warning, Captain. Find permanent solution for those 6 boys. The war is ending. They can't remain in military custody much longer. Yes, sir. I'm working on it. Work faster. You've bought them time and safety and education. Now get them futures. Sullivan returned to the barn that evening, looked at 6 boys who had become something more than prisoners, who had become his responsibility, his mission. Perhaps, in some sense that transcended war and nationality, his children. He didn't know yet what would happen to them, but he knew he would do everything in his power to ensure they survived not just the war, but the peace that followed. They had come to him as enemies. They had become something else. Now they needed to become something more. May 15th, 1945. Germany surrendered unconditionally 1 week earlier. The war in Europe was officially over. Captain Nathaniel Sullivan gathered the 6 boys in the barn on a warm morning that smelled of cut grass and distant possibility. Sergeant Margot Hoffman stood beside him. After 3 weeks, the boys understood enough English to follow most of what Sullivan would say. Sullivan looked at 6 faces that had changed dramatically since April. They had gained weight. Their eyes held something other than fear. But they were still children in a world that had no clear place for them. The war is over, Sullivan began. Margot translated anyway. Germany has surrendered. You are no longer enemy combatants. You are children who were caught in something that should never have happened. He paused, letting that truth settle. You have 2 choices now. Heinrich sat straighter. Beside him, Lucas gripped his hand. Choice 1. Repatriation to Germany. We will process you through displaced persons camps. We will attempt to locate any surviving family members. Sullivan's voice remained neutral, but his face showed the grim reality of that option. Choice 2. If American families volunteer to sponsor you, if we can arrange special immigration status, you may stay in the United States. You would become permanent residents, eventually citizens. The silence in the barn was profound. This is not a decision to make lightly. Staying means leaving Germany behind. Your language, your culture, your identity as Germans. You would become something new. Margot's voice trembled slightly as she translated. Returning to Germany means going home, but I won't lie about what you'd find. Your country is devastated, millions dead, cities destroyed. It will take decades to rebuild. He looked at each boy individually. Think carefully. I need your answers in 1 week. The week that followed was the longest of their captivity. Heinrich wrestled with competing duties. Part of him believed his responsibility lay in returning to Germany. Someone had to rebuild from the ruins. But what could a 15-year-old accomplish in a devastated nation? He had no family, no home, no resources. In America, opportunities existed. The Hendersons had visited twice, kind people who offered education, stability, perhaps even university. But choosing that felt like abandonment. Wolfgang faced the deepest internal struggle. His entire identity had been constructed around being German, serving the fatherland. Yet the Germany he loved didn't exist anymore. The values he'd been taught had been revealed as monstrous lies. Klaus approached the decision with characteristic pragmatism. Father, almost certainly dead. Mother's fate, unknown. In Germany, he would be another orphaned teenager with no prospects. In America, he had discovered aptitudes. The Walshes had visited, Tobias Walsh, who had lost his son in the Pacific, who offered apprenticeship, education, a future. Dieter thought about 4 generations of his family working Hamburg soil. But his father was dead. The farm would be seized or abandoned. Farmer Amos Cole had visited, offering to teach American techniques. Perhaps he could farm in America, reconnect with soil not soaked in blood. Franz had the clearest decision because he had the least to lose. Parents dead, Cologne destroyed. Doctor. Nathaniel Klein had offered education, medical training, a future. Lucas was only 10. He didn't understand all the implications, but he understood Heinrich was struggling. He pressed close to the older boy and whispered, "Can I stay with you, whatever you choose?" Heinrich's eyes reddened. He pulled Lucas close. "I don't know yet, little brother." On the 6th day, Heinrich made his decision. He would return to Germany. Someone had to rebuild. Someone had to remember. Someone had to carry forward what was good and true, while rejecting the poison that had corrupted it. He told the others that evening. When he finished, Lucas started crying. "You're leaving us." "Not leaving, going home. There's a difference." "Feels the same," Wolfgang said quietly. The other 5 looked miserable but didn't argue. They understood duty. Sullivan made arrangements, contacted the Red Cross, initiated repatriation paperwork. 3 weeks and 1 day later, the response arrived. Margot read it first. Her face went pale. "I have to tell him. I'll be there." They found Heinrich in the barn, teaching Lucas English vocabulary. He looked up with a smile that faded when he saw their expressions. Margot sat across from him, read the letter slowly, translating as she went. Heinrich's Berlin neighborhood, 100% destroyed, no surviving structures, no surviving residents. Red Cross had located no family members, no aunts, uncles, cousins, no one. Displaced persons camps at maximum capacity. Priority given to families and women with children. Single adolescent males being turned away. The assessment was brutally clear. Repatriation for this individual would likely result in homelessness and death within 6 months. Current mortality rate for unaccompanied minors estimated at 80%. Heinrich stopped hearing after that. The words blurred. He couldn't go home even if he wanted to. Home didn't exist. "I understand," he said quietly. Sullivan knelt to meet the boy's eyes. "Heinrich, sometimes living is the way to honor the dead. Your mother wanted you to have a future. Staying alive, building a good life, that's how you respect her memory." Heinrich nodded. Tears streamed down his face. Not from fear, from overwhelming relief at having the decision taken from him, mixed with crushing guilt about feeling relieved. Lucas threw his arms around Heinrich. You're staying with me." The other boys surrounded them. Klaus, Wolfgang, Dieter, Franz. 6 boys holding each other in afternoon light. Porter watched from the doorway. Some moments required only silence. 1 week later, 6 American families arrived. Catherine Henderson came first, a schoolteacher in her 50s with kind eyes. She spoke with Heinrich for an hour. She and her husband had 2 grown daughters and an empty house. They could offer education, stability, space to discover who he wanted to become. Esther Porter arrived from Georgia, Silas Porter's older sister. A force of nature, loud, warm, utterly unintimidated by adding a 10-year-old German boy to her household of 4 children. Lucas was overwhelmed, but found himself smiling. Amos Cole came in dusty work clothes smelling of cows and hay. He shook Dieter's hand with the firm grip of lifelong labor. They spoke through Margot about farming. Dieter felt something settle in his chest. Tobias Walsh had mechanic's hands, scarred, stained, strong. He looked at Klaus with unconcealed grief and hope. My son was 19 when he died. I'm not trying to replace him. I'm channeling what I feel into helping someone live. If you want to learn, I'll teach you everything I know. Pastor Ezekiel Reed and his wife Sarah came together. They sat with Wolfgang for a long time. You've been taught things that turned out to be lies. That's not your fault. But you'll need time and help to figure out what you actually believe. We can provide that, if you're willing. Dr. Nathaniel Klein came last. He observed Franz carefully. You don't trust easily. That's smart. But I'm offering a practical arrangement. I teach, you learn, eventually you use that knowledge to help people. Fair trade. Franz studied the doctor. Why me? Because you survived. Survivors make the best healers if they choose that path. The meetings concluded. 6 families agreed to proceed. General Hartwell expedited special immigration status. The boys would leave within 2 weeks. August 30th, 1945. 6 boys stood in front of the barn one final time. Sullivan addressed them with military formality, barely concealing emotion. You came as prisoners. You leave as young men with futures. Remember, being German is not the same as being Nazi. Your culture, your language, your heritage. Be proud of these. The ideology was the disease. You are not diseased. You are survivors. Margot could barely speak through tears. I was ashamed to be German after what we learned, but you 6 showed me we can be different. We can choose to be better. Porter stepped forward carrying a canvas bag. From it he pulled 6 baseballs, each signed. To my German nephew Heinrich, Uncle Silas, 1945. To my German nephew Lucas, Uncle Silas, 1945. 1 for each boy. When you teach your children to play, Porter said, voice thick, remember we chose to see you as children, not enemies. Remember that even in the worst circumstances, people can choose kindness. Heinrich gripped his baseball like a lifeline. I will keep this forever. Lucas hugged his to his chest, crying openly. Wolfgang stared at his with wonder. This reminds me enemies can become brothers. Klaus examined the stitching, nodded approval. Dieter smiled genuinely for the first time in weeks. I'll teach my children to catch with this. Even Franz felt tears come. He looked at Porter and managed, thank you. The 6 embraced in the barn one last time. Heinrich pulled them close. We are brothers now, not by blood, but by what we survived together. We write letters, we stay connected, and 60 years from now, we meet here again, all of us. 60 years, Klaus agreed. I'll be 70, Lucas calculated. We'll all be old men, Wolfgang said, with stories to tell. They separated, climbed into vehicles that would take them to new families, turned back one last time to wave. Sullivan watched them go and felt something break and heal simultaneously. That night, alone in his office, he wrote a letter he would never send. To my 6 boys, I think about you every day. Did I do the right thing? I violated orders, played God with your lives. I gave you cornbread when protocol said bullets. I wake wondering, what if you'd been better off in Germany? What if I took you from your culture and you became lost? I have no answers. I only know that when I looked at your faces, I saw my son, Robert. I saw every child who deserves childhood, not war. I hope you forgive me. I hope you live well. Your American father, Nathaniel Sullivan. He folded the letter, put it in his desk drawer, locked it with his doubts. The years passed in the way years do, slowly, then quickly. Heinrich Werber became Henry Henderson, attended college, earned a doctorate in German literature, became Professor Henderson at University of Massachusetts, published a memoir in 1973, From Enemy to American, married Alice, raised 3 children, 5 grandchildren. Lucas Hoffman became Luke Porter, grew up in Georgia surrounded by cousins, became a railroad engineer, named his eldest son Silas, married Betty, 5 children who never knew hunger or war. Klaus Richter became Marcus Walsh, mastered the mechanic's trade, attended engineering school, became an automotive safety engineer in Detroit, designed airbag systems that saved thousands of lives, married Ruth, 2 children. Dieter Schneider became Derek Cole, farmed in Vermont, combining German and American methods, married Hannah, 4 children who continued the tradition, 3 generations farming the same soil. Wolfgang Bauer became Stephen Reed, attended seminary, became a minister specializing in youth counseling, 40 years helping radicalized young people unlearn hatred. Married Grace, 4 children, known as the gentlest man anyone had met. Franz Keller became Francis Klein, medical school, emergency medicine, 40 years in a Chicago trauma center, saved hundreds of lives. Married Jennifer, 1 daughter who became a doctor, died in 2003 of a heart attack while performing CPR, age 69. They wrote letters constantly for 60 years, weekly at first, then monthly as families demanded time, met every 10 years in different cities, brought children, introduced spouses, shared lives. Each man kept his baseball in a place of honor, showed it to children and grandchildren, told the story of cornbread and kindness and an American soldier who chose mercy. September 7th, 2005. The farmhouse outside Verim, Bavaria, had been converted into a small museum. The barn still stood, restored but authentic. 5 elderly men arrived over the course of the morning. Henry Henderson, 75 years old, Luke Porter, 70, Marcus Walsh, 74, Derek Cole, 73, Stephen Reed, 72. They embraced in the courtyard, old men crying without shame, 60 years compressed into moments. Dr. Sarah Klein arrived carrying her father's photograph, 45 years old, an emergency physician like Francis. Dad wanted to be here, but his heart gave out 2 years ago. They hugged her. France was with them in spirit. The young German curator gave them a private tour. They saw photographs of themselves at 10, 12, 14, 15. Emaciated, terrified, wearing uniforms too large. They saw the framed cornbread recipe under glass. Henry laughed through tears. That dish saved our lives. They saw letters to families who no longer existed, preserved as historical documents. They saw a baseball exhibit, 1 ball donated years ago, signed by Silas Porter. Then the curator said, "We have a new donation. The Sullivan family sent it last week." She brought out a wooden box. Inside, dozens of letters, and 1 envelope marked Unsent, 1946. Henry opened it with trembling hands, read aloud in German, then English. Sullivan's confession of doubt, his fear he had done wrong, his hope they would forgive him. When he finished, silence lasted nearly a minute. He thought we needed to forgive him? Henry's voice broke. He saved our lives, gave us futures, and he felt guilty? The curator spoke gently. "Captain Sullivan's son is here. He wanted to meet you." Robert Sullivan Jr. entered, 70 years old, looked eerily like his father. He carried a thick folder. "Gentlemen," he began, voice shaking, "my father talked about you 6 every single day for 38 years. You weren't just a decision, you were his proudest achievement. He kept every letter, every photograph. He cried when your children were born, celebrated when you graduated, grieved when Francis died." He opened the folder. Hundreds of letters organized by sender and date. Luke Porter stepped forward, embraced Robert Sullivan Jr., sobbed into the man's shoulder. "Your father gave me a childhood. Tell him, wherever he is, we forgive, we love, we thank him. He didn't take anything. He gave us everything." Derek spoke through tears. "He didn't play God, he played human." Marcus added, "Protocol said bullets. He chose cornbread. That choice created 5 families, 23 children, 41 grandchildren." Stephen said quietly. I was taught hatred. He taught mercy. That lesson saved my soul. Sarah Klein spoke last. My father's last words were, "Thank Captain Sullivan. I got to save lives because he saved mine." That evening, the museum hosted dinner for the 5 men, Robert Sullivan Jr. and their families. 37 people, 3 generations. The menu, cornbread and chili. Amara Porter, Silas's granddaughter, cooked it using his handwritten 1945 recipe. Before they ate, Henry stood and raised his glass. To Captain Sullivan, Sergeant Hoffman, Private Porter. To the Americans who chose to see us as children. To cornbread that tasted like freedom. They ate and cried and laughed. Luke whispered, "Tastes exactly the same. Tastes like home." After dinner, Henry pulled a baseball from his bag. Worn leather. Faded stitching. Still readable. To my German nephew Heinrich, Uncle Silas, 1945. The other 4 men produced theirs. Sarah held her father's. Henry handed his to Robert Sullivan Jr. Your father gave us these. We carried them 60 years. Now they return to the family that saved us. Robert protested. I can't. You can. They belong to your father's legacy. Robert accepted, then handed it to his 12-year-old grandson, Nathaniel. This ball represents the best choice your great-grandfather ever made. Remember it. Outside the barn, they unveiled a memorial plaque. In this barn, April 1945, Captain Nathaniel Sullivan chose mercy over protocol. 6 German children received cornbread instead of bullets. This choice proved, even in war, humanity survives. In memory of Captain Nathaniel Sullivan, Sergeant Margot Hoffman, Private Silas Porter. In honor of the 6 who lived, Heinrich, Lucas, Klaus, Dieter, Wolfgang, Franz. They were somebody's children. Henry Henderson spoke to the assembled crowd, his voice carrying across the Bavarian evening. We were enemies who became brothers. We were children who became Americans without forgetting we were German. We were given cornbread and a second chance. He paused, looked at the faces around him. Captain Sullivan died in June of 1983. All 6 of us attended his funeral in Fort Worth, Texas. We stood at his graveside and told everyone who would listen what I tell you now. This man saved our lives. Not with bullets, with cornbread, with seeing us as human. He gestured to the families surrounding him, children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren. From 6 condemned boys came all of this. 23 children, 41 grandchildren, 18 great-grandchildren. Teachers, doctors, engineers, farmers, ministers, good people raising good children who will raise good children. His voice strengthened. Captain Sullivan taught us that nationality is accident of birth, character is choice, mercy is strength, and every enemy was somebody's child. He looked at young Nathaniel Sullivan holding the baseball, then at his own grandson Thomas standing nearby. This is our legacy. Choose compassion. Always. He nodded to the boys. Nathaniel tossed the ball gently to Thomas. Thomas caught it, threw it back. 2 boys, 3 generations removed from war. 1 American, 1 German-American, playing catch with a baseball signed 60 years ago. The sun set over the Bavarian countryside, painting the sky gold and amber. 5 old men stood together, watching children play. Remembering when they were those children. Remembering cornbread and kindness, and the American captain who looked at them and saw sons instead of soldiers. Henry's voice, soft now, carried just to the 4 men beside him. We kept our promise. 60 years, we came back. All of us, Luke said, touching the photograph of Francis in Sarah's hands. All of us, the others echoed. Behind them, the barn stood as witness. Inside, ghosts of 6 frightened boys no longer waited for execution that never came. They had moved on, become men, become fathers, become grandfathers, become the proof that mercy matters, that kindness compounds. That one choice can echo across generations. The baseball arced through golden evening light. 60 years had passed, but the lesson endured. All because one captain looked at 6 enemies and saw 6 sons. All because one private cooked cornbread with his grandmother's recipe. All because mercy was chosen over protocol. All because someone remembered they were somebody's children. And that changed everything.